Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our September Trust Talk, Who Built the City on the Severn, Slavery, and Craft in Early America. So Trust Talks is a virtual series where we bring emerging scholars together with established professionals in order to generate exciting dialogue around new research and scholarship. And we are so excited to share this lecture series with you today. We're going to be hearing from Bethany McGlyn. She is the Sewell C. Biggs Curatorial Fellow at Winterthur. She recently graduated from the Winterthur program in American Material Culture, and she got her undergrad in art history from Towson University. And she's going to be the main speaker in our lecture today. And she's going to be joined in conversation with visiting assistant professor of Southern Studies at Sewanee University of the South, Tiffany Momon. Tiffany earned her PhD from Middle Tennessee University, and she's also the founder of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. And we are so thrilled to share them both in conversation today. I hope you really enjoy this lecture, and if you want to continue to support emerging scholars, please consider donating to the Decorative Arts Trust. And without further ado, I turn it over to Bethany. Bethany?
In October of 1756, saddlemaker Nathan Waters traveled from his home in Maryland's urban center of Annapolis to the house of his mother and stepfather in the frontier town of Frederick. Waters rode westward for approximately 70 miles, perhaps using a saddle of his own making, on a trip that likely inspired some mix of anticipation, excitement, and anxiety for the upstart artisan. As he neared his destination, Waters may have imagined how drastically his life would soon change. Indeed, the purpose of his journey would significantly change his social status, his career, and his household forever. Also making the journey was Waters's 15-year-old apprentice, Charles Willson Peale, for whom the trip to Frederick would be just as formative. In only the second year of his indenture, which he begrudgingly remembered as abject servitude later in life, the young Peale had likely never traveled so far from home and almost certainly never participated in the kind of business for which Waters brought him to Frederick. In addition to the supplies necessary for their journey, Waters and Peale likely rode with a wagon or a cart in tow. They needed the extra space not for what they brought to Frederick, but for whom they would bring home. James, an enslaved boy, and Nell, Hester, and Dinah, enslaved women, all purchased from Waters's stepfather, Henry Moroni. Waters paid his stepfather 40 pounds sterling for James, Nell, Hester, and Dinah, as well as the increase or any of the enslaved women's future offspring, evidenced by a surviving deed to which the young Charles Willson Peale stood witness. Prior documentation does not indicate whether this was Nathan Waters' first time acting in slavery's marketplace, but it may well have been. His move to Annapolis from Philadelphia in 1750, presumably after completing his own apprenticeship, indicates that his purchase came in an early stage of his career. But whether it was his first purchase of enslaved people or not, Waters clearly went on to see the benefits that enslaved labor provided his business and his household. By 1776, Waters's household included 12 enslaved individuals, 3 men, 2 women, and 7 children, some of them likely the children of Nell, Hester, and Dinah. Though it's impossible to know, Peale, living in his own state of unfreedom, did not seem to have been particularly distressed or affected by witnessing the sale of James, Nell, Hester, and Dinah at 15. Once free from his indenture, Peale quickly eschewed his training as a saddler to establish himself as a portrait painter. Peale followed in the footsteps of Nathan Waters, however, when he expanded his own household to include Scarborough and Lucy Williams, an enslaved couple reportedly given to him as payment for a local plantation owner's portrait. By 1778, once Peale moved his family to Philadelphia, he wrote wishfully to his younger brother, St. George, quote, "I have a desire to purchase an enslaved boy to wait on me. I have long wanted one." Peel's desire for an enslaved boy may have come from his journey westward with Nathan Waters in 1756. The young Peel would have watched as Waters put James to work in the saddler's shop, sent him on errands around the city, and commanded his labor at home. While Charles Willson Peel also sat powerless to his master, he knew, even at a young age, the crucial difference between his position as an apprentice and that of James. Peel would someday be free, James would not. While in Annapolis, Peel and the Williamses lived and worked in an ever-growing network of artisans and those they enslaved. They, of course, interacted with the household of Nathan Waters, but also Waters' son-in-law, cabinetmaker Archibald Chisholm, and Chisholm's two-time business partner, John Shaw. No surviving records indicate whether Charles Willson Peel ever bought the enslaved boy whom he long wanted, but Scarborough and Lucy had a child of their own, Moses Williams, who remained enslaved in Peel's Philadelphia household until 27 years of age. Moses worked as an integral member of Peel's museum staff and excelled at skills like taxidermy, exhibition design, and silhouette making on a device called the physiognotrace. One surviving silhouette attributed to Moses Williams resides today at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Made with white laid paper on black cardstock and measuring 4 by 5 inches in length, it is a small object that has survived among hundreds of similar silhouettes fashioned at Peel's Philadelphia Museum. The silhouette is titled Mr. Shaw's Black Man, a title that identifies the sitter not by his name, but only in relation to his enslaver and his race, creating his existence solely within the institution of slavery. Mr. Shaw's Black Man is remarkable as one of few early silhouettes of Black Americans. But even more remarkable is that, as its title suggests, the sitter was enslaved. The exact identity of Moses Williams' enslaved sitter remains a mystery, but the Peel family's Annapolis origins provide the most compelling possibility. Among the strongest relationships that Charles Willson Peel built while living in Annapolis was with John Shaw. Shaw's first documented encounter with the Peel family came when he worked as a carpenter alongside Peel's younger brother, James, on the construction site of lawyer and politician James Bryce's Annapolis townhouse. Even after Peel moved his family to Philadelphia, the two artisans continued to share workshop space, materials, and skills whenever Peel visited Annapolis. While John Shaw never reached the heights of Charles Willson Peel's national acclaim, both men are remembered today as tastemakers, civic leaders, revolutionaries, and perhaps above all, talented businessmen. Scholars have analyzed the textual, visual, and material archives associated with these artisans, and many like them, for decades. But what might focusing on their roles as enslavers and their lives in Annapolis reveal differently? Directing our gaze to Annapolis introduces the possibility that Mr. Shaw's Black Man was one of the many Black men enslaved by cabinetmaker John Shaw. Shaw's 1829 will lists the names of 5 men and teenage boys, including James, John, George, Henry Kennard, and Henry Gibson, any of whom could have been this portrait's sitter. It's not surprising that a man enslaved by Shaw might find himself in Philadelphia. Like many Annapolitans, Shaw had ties, both professional and familial, to Philadelphia and traveled there often. Shaw perhaps brought his bondman to Peel's Philadelphia Museum to have his likeness made, but the sitter may have also sought out Moses Williams independently. Moses's parents, Scarborough and Lucy, lived with Charles Willson Peel and his family in Annapolis before relocating to Philadelphia. The Williamses undoubtedly lived and worked among other men, women, and children enslaved in the households and workshops of Annapolis's artisans. Though scholars suggest that Moses Williams was born in Philadelphia, he was likely still familiar with his parents' Annapolis network, enslaved men and women who likely also knew of Moses Williams's reputation and accomplishments in Philadelphia. This story is but one example of how the framing of our inquiries and the direction of our focus can shed new light on well-known objects associated with well-known makers. I use this approach in my own research, which focuses on slavery and craft, and how it relates to craft. More specifically, how servants and enslaved people contributed to the production of material goods like furniture and silver, how they designed and maintained outdoor spaces like private gardens and public landscapes, and how they built, quite literally, homes, workshops, storefronts, and government buildings. And while I discuss things from architecture to cabinet making, silversmithing, sewing in my thesis, I thought that for the sake of time this evening, I would focus my discussion around one object in particular, a tall case clock in the collection of Historic Annapolis. Oops. This clock, aside from being a beautiful piece, is the only known and signed collaboration between cabinet makers John Shaw, Archibald Chisholm, and clockmaker William Faris. Though the clock is signed and dated, signed and labeled by Faris, Shaw, and Chisholm, it's not dated. But the label used by Shaw and Chisholm's workshop effectively dates the piece between the years of 1772 and 1776. And because this piece can be definitively traced to these three artisans' workshops, I think it can be a really useful way to begin searching for enslaved artisans. At the time of this clock's construction and the construction of the other objects I have up on the screen here, tax and census records tell us that John Shaw and Archibald Chisholm enslaved 8 and 7 individuals respectively. And before I go on here, I want to stop for just a moment and explain why this data, why these numbers are so remarkable given the time and the place that we're talking about. Historian Jean Rousseau compiled the data and has done the math and found that while 3/4 of white families in Annapolis lived in households that also included enslaved and free Black people, the majority of households in Annapolis included one enslaved person. So the majority of households in Annapolis include one enslaved person, but here we have John Shaw's household with 8 enslaved people, Archibald Chisholm's with 7, saddlemaker Nathan Waters with 12, staymaker Charles Wallace with 14, printer Frederick Green with 6, carpenter Jeb Fowler also 6. And I think we fall into this trap often, I know that I did, of expecting these kinds of numbers from the lawyers and the politicians and even the merchants, right? But the data is telling us that in Annapolis, and I would expect elsewhere, it's artisans who are in this upper bracket of slave ownership. And I don't think that it's dangerous or reckless to infer that this is because enslaved labor was so crucial to the success of their businesses. Unfortunately, I don't have that magic source that tells me what every single person in Shaw and Chisholm's shop contributed to this clock case. And while enslaved men may or may not have been executing the fine fretwork carving or the construction of the case itself, they were likely at least transporting materials, sawing and planing wood, working from patterns designed by Shaw himself, and varnishing and even transporting finished pieces. An advertisement placed by William Faris, who also contributed to this clock's construction, gives us yet another way to consider this object as a product of enslaved labor. Faris in 1778 took to the Maryland Journal to announce his plans to sell an enslaved silversmith. Faris did not name the enslaved man, describe his physical features, or note anything about his mannerisms or personality in the advertisement, but instead focused on his abilities and therefore his financial worth as an artisan. Faris noted that the young man is by trade a silversmith, jeweler, and lapidary, and that there are very few, if any, better workmen in America. And Faris may well have believed that the man he enslaved was an exceptionally skilled and diligent worker. However, Faris's high praise was more likely intended to appeal to buyers. Like all sources, this advertisement can only tell us so much. It, in many ways, leaves many more questions than answers. However, it seems safe to assume that the man Faris enslaved was heavily involved in the day-to-day production in Faris's workshop. Though he's remembered today as one of early Maryland's most accomplished silversmiths, scholars have long questioned Faris's knowledge of the craft. The authors of a 1975 catalog of silver from the Baltimore Museum of Art claim that Faris, quote, may have actually learned the silversmith's craft from hired workmen. In more recent work on Faris, scholars claim that, quote, to state a piece of silver with Faris's mark was made by him is not necessarily accurate, inasmuch as William Faris may have never actually hammered silver. These scholars suggest that Faris relied on the knowledge of journeymen or even his own sons, but this advertisement allows us to consider that the many silver objects that left his shop before 1778, including the face of this tall case clock, are products of a highly skilled, professionally trained enslaved silversmith. From the advertisement, we learn that the enslaved man would have worked in Faris's shop to raise, cast, and chase silver, gold, and other metals, make repairs, fashion and mend jewelry, and carve and set stones. While Faris was likely responsible for the clock's inner works, the silversmith he enslaved clearly had the skill necessary to craft the clock's face. The clock's spandrels, for instance, are identical to two other Faris clocks, both in private collections, indicating that they were cast from the same mold, a task that would have certainly been possible for an enslaved silversmith. The Rococo engraving around the tympanum, featuring botanical imagery and sea scroll designs, may well have also been executed by the enslaved silversmith. Most intriguing to me is the possibility that William Faris's own signature, engraved on a silver plate inside the chapter ring, was engraved not by Faris, but by the silversmith he enslaved, unable to include his own signature or mark on this piece of work. And while advertisements are crucial sources for pairing with extant objects, they can also tell us much about how and where enslaved artisans lived, how they moved through the city, and what access they had to other material goods. A runaway advertisement posted in the Maryland Gazette by James Bryce is one such source. In this advertisement, Bryce calls for the return of Jem, a 28-year-old artisan when this ad was posted in 1797. From the advertisement alone, we learn that Jem, like many enslaved artisans in Annapolis and elsewhere, was skilled across trades. He worked as a waiter, cared for horses, drove carriages, and was also a gardener, carpenter, and bricklayer. In describing his lost property as very artful and able to turn his hand to anything, Bryce likely meant to portray Jem as cunning and untrustworthy, but instead we see a talented and capable artisan whose material and economic contributions his enslaver sorely missed. As is often the case with enslaved people, Jem appears in the archival record only briefly and through the perspective of his enslaver. No extant sources reveal whether Jem successfully claimed his freedom, and if so, where he ended up. Likewise, we are left to wonder about the details of Jem's life before he claimed his own freedom on December 9th, 1797. It's impossible to know the circumstances of Jem's enslavement to the Bryce family. He could have been purchased as a child or teenager, may have become Bryce's property through his wife, Sarah Frisbee, or may have descended from generations of people enslaved by the Bryce family. If Jem was born on one of the Bryce family plantations, it is possible, if not probable, that he learned one or more of his trades from a relative. Scholars, including Mary Thompson and Christine Daniels, have demonstrated how skilled and domestic occupations were often hereditary within enslaved families. Indeed, the enslaved artisan or artisans who trained Jem may have been some of the many enslaved men to build James Bryce's Annapolis townhouse. The account books kept by Bryce during his house's construction list the names and roles of several enslaved artisans. We know that men enslaved by Bryce dug the cellar, molded and fired bricks, sawed and planed wood, and that he also rented the labor of other enslaved artisans who lived throughout the city, like William Reed's enslaved Sawyer and Watt Wright, an artisan enslaved by Charles Wallace. But this advertisement can tell us even more. Bryce noted that Jem constantly attended the meetings of the Methodists, that he drove a carriage, and that he was even granted a pass to visit Baltimore, indicating that Jem experienced a relative freedom of movement throughout the city and the region. Bryce wrote that Jem absconded with a watch of his own, a fine hat, a new coat, language indicating that Jem owned more and better than the average enslaved person in Annapolis, and that he had his own purchasing power as what Anne Smart Martin might call a player in the world of goods. Objects, especially when paired with archival sources and data, give us the ability to learn much about life and labor in early Annapolis. Though I've only been able to share with you a tiny sliver of my research that I've worked on for the past couple of years, I hope that you leave this presentation understanding that there is much more to learn and much more to do. Someone who has been doing that work is Dr. Tiffany Momon, founder of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, and I'm really excited to share the next portion of this talk with her.
There it goes. Thank you, Bethany. First, I really enjoyed your presentation, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you today on this Trust Talk. I want to first begin by asking you why you chose this topic for your research.
Yeah, so as Carrie mentioned, I went to school in Maryland. I went to college at Towson University. And I also worked in several Maryland museums, including at Historic Annapolis. And I had some really great early American history and Black history professors at Towson who really got me thinking about the centrality of slavery to early America. And so I found myself really interested in the roles that enslaved men and women played in the things that I was most interested in. So art, architecture, and decorative arts in Annapolis. But I found that no one could really answer the questions that I had. So when I started my master's degree at Winterthur, I really knew that I wanted to focus on that research, which makes me think to ask you why you started the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive.
Sure. Well, you know, there's a larger story there about how the project was connected to a research project that I completed for the MESDA Summer Institute. But simply put, no one was looking at the data the way that I wanted to look at the data. And I wanted a resource to use that moved beyond traditional archives and just sort of the endless collecting and cataloging of names. You know, I wanted to ask more questions. I wanted to more fully interpret the data, and I wanted to be able to see these people. And one of the ways that I found where I could see them essentially was through place. And we all understand the power that place has, hence the creation of the map that accompanies the archive. And, you know, when I think about it, I really just wanted to facilitate discussions about the topic, to have, you know, more conversations about the topic, to bring people in and show them that there was so much more work here to be done on the subject of Black craftspeople. And, you know, it really, I just found that there was so much more to the story, and it really became a situation for me where I kind of felt like, you know, that famous quote by late Congressman John Lewis, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? So I went for it, and we're only beginning in this work. You know, our beta site launched almost a month ago, you know, just putting proof to the concept that we had, but I am very excited about the plans that we have, the way that we're strategizing our growth, and where we're headed next. And looking at your presentation, one of the things that I was thinking about was your use of sources. Can you speak to the sources that you used in your research?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, most obviously, right, I used objects, I used buildings and landscapes. Those to me, and I'm sure to many of us here, are the most fun sources. But to make any of those sources compelling, I had to pair them with archival sources too. So account books, receipts, correspondence, tax and census records, all of these things were really important for my research. And it's worth noting that the majority of sources that I had to use were sources associated with white craftspeople, right, with enslavers. So it involved a lot of digging through papers associated with John Shaw and with William Faris, with Charles Willson Peale, and finding maybe one name or one line every few boxes and stringing those tiny fragments together into something that ultimately makes sense, hopefully makes sense. And one of the most useful kinds of sources for me, as you likely saw from my presentation, were advertisements. So both sale advertisements and runaway advertisements can have so much detail, and historians of slavery who work primarily with ads sometimes make the comparison between these advertisements and portraiture because of the way that they often describe physical features and tell us so much about a person's life, even though obviously biased.
Oh, great points. You know, something that I immediately thought of when you were talking about in your response there was how, as my colleague, Dr. Torrin Gadsden, always puts it, you know, these runaway slave ads are really just a larger form of surveillance, right? Providing people with the ability to look out and watch others. You know, when we began the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, we intentionally began by using runaway slave ads. You know, I was immediately interested in the descriptions of what self-emancipated craftspeople were taking with them. I was specifically wondering if they were taking tools. How often were they taking tools? Comparing numbers, how many people took tools versus how many people didn't take tools with them. And I was also interested very much so in what they were wearing. You know, often you'll come across these advertisements where it mentions that the self-emancipated people left, you know, wearing their apron. And something that I noticed about Annapolis was just the detailed descriptions of the clothing that they were wearing and what they also, and the clothing that they took with them. And, you know, as you mentioned, there's just so much in those advertisements that raises so many questions. You know, advertisements provide us with information on, and for my use, practice trades. You know, I came across an advertisement just yesterday in Tennessee, actually, and the enslaver mentions in the advertisement that the self-emancipated Black man liked to pretend to be a carpenter. And I was like, well, that's how you see him, as he's out here, you know, pretending. But these advertisements also contain, you know, physical descriptions. They mention literacy, as in people, you know, forging passes that say that they could be away. They mentioned, you know, why they self-emancipated, among possible destinations and more. And, you know, in doing this work, I was inspired by historian Lorenzo Green, who first began looking at this data in the 1940s in New England. And then later, this practice was picked up by historian Lathan Windley, who began to look at this data in the South in the 1970s. And just, you know, in so many ways, the advertisements speak for themselves, but it's up to us as scholars to analyze them and interpret them.
Absolutely. I mean, really, aside from advertisements, I think the most important group of sources that I pulled together for this research was the data that I shared just a little bit of on slave ownership among artisans in Annapolis. You know, I would find myself getting really frustrated with the sources that I had to rely on, because in reflecting only the experiences and the perspectives of the enslaver, they couldn't tell me much about individual people and individual stories, which is what we all are really interested in as historians. But one thing that I learned is that even biased and incomplete sources can tell you something. Even those numbers helped me paint a picture of what the social landscape was like in Annapolis. It's astounding to think that artisans who, as we know in early America, very rarely did well enough to support themselves and their families, often died destitute, were in the upper echelon of slave ownership in Annapolis. And I think that that's really what kept them going after the revolution, when Baltimore quickly surpasses Annapolis as the economic center of the state, and many wealthy patrons start to leave. So while the sources can sometimes feel really limiting, I think I finished this project understanding that I'm not going to have all of the answers, and that my work builds on the work of scholars before me, just like there's so much left to do for people who will inevitably build on my work in the future.
And I would like to build on the point that you just made when you mentioned that there's more work to be done. So, archives, museums, and historic sites have historically been complicit in the erasure of Black craftspeople from the narrative through a variety of techniques, the most common of which is just choosing to ignore the facts, right? And so we've all been on problematic museum tours, and I was just suddenly reminded of a tour I took as a graduate student years ago, looking at a slave dwelling in Tennessee, and the tour guide mentioned that the slave dwelling was built so well that it was impossible that enslaved craftspeople built it, to which I called him out and I said, well, what you're saying actually doesn't match the primary sources related to the construction of this dwelling, right? Which told the story of enslaved craftspeople at that site constructing that building. And, going forward, our work and the work that we do really has to combat that type of behavior. I tell people all the time, we've come far in these discussions, but we haven't come far enough. And, it's not enough to just consider yourself to be a good museum or a historic site now. And someone that I refer back to often is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who mentioned that, he told the public back in 1902 in his book, The Negro Artisan, that they were getting the story wrong about these contributions, that they weren't talking about them enough, that they weren't highlighting them, enough. And so I think, that being published in 1902, today being, 2020, it's about time that we all stop and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's not just a museum interpretation, right? It's in publications too, and it's in public facing materials that we put out. I shared the advertisement posted for the Silversmith that William Faris wanted to sell. I didn't find that advertisement. That was not a new discovery. It's been around for a while, and yet in every single publication on William Faris, there's no mention of the fact that there's an enslaved silversmith working in his shop. It's always, oh, he learned from his sons, or he learned from an apprentice, or, an indentured servant or a journeyman. And I think that, that, like you said, it's a willing erasure, right? It's not, oh, I didn't know that this source existed. It's this source has been around and I'm just choosing not to interpret it. And something that I try to do in my own work now, I mean, when I get the chance to write social media posts for Winterthur, right? Is I try to do just little things. There are so many big things that we need to do, but it's little things too. And I wrote a social media post about a ladle that comes from William Faris's shop that we have at Winterthur. And just in the careful word choice of saying made in the workshop of William Faris instead of made by William Faris. These are little things that are still really important when we want to give people credit for their labor, which is so important. And so much of, I think, what we do as decorative arts historians that for some reason isn't always carrying over. We're not thinking hard enough.
And one thing that I always think about is how important it is to give people credit for their labor. Often when we are talking about enslaved craftspeople, we may not know who specifically did the work, but we know enough to make a general statement, like you just mentioned, that it came out of this person's shop and that they used enslaved labor in that shop. And it reminds me, a lot, these enslaved craftspeople wanted recognition for their work, right? And, you can see that through the work, through people who signed things, right? And I'm specifically thinking of David Drake, but I think the potter David Drake, who of course signed his pots and wrote poetry on them. But I'm also thinking about a plasterer in Wilmington, North Carolina, who worked on the Bellamy Mansion, William Gould, who signed the back of a piece of plaster a decorative plaster that was going on the wall that no one would have ever seen, right? And I'm just thinking about the power in that, in signing this object, knowing full well that it's never meant for anyone to see it, but yet feeling compelled enough to sign your name to it, and thinking about what that means in terms of agency and identity and wanting to be associated with the work that they were making. And there's just power in that, and to me that's just something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned David Drake and William Gould, because I think that their work really underscores something that the Winterthur program and other, graduate programs in material culture, historic preservation, what have you, kind of drills into us as scholars, which is the power of close looking. I think that, many of us in the field right now are questioning the value and the definition of what decorative arts scholars have traditionally defined as connoisseurship. But to me, knowing how a dovetail is made, or knowing the strength needed to lay bricks all day, these things help me better understand labor. They help me write about not just who was doing work, but how they did work, and how the specialized skills and knowledge and that kind of bodily memory that enslaved people brought to their work kind of really operated, right? And I think that, understanding how pieces are made, those at Mesda and Winterthur, those Colonial Williamsburg, those rare moments to like turn a piece of wood and like try to engrave something, make you really realize, oh, that is extremely difficult and that takes so much work. And I think that is so important for us to keep in mind as we write about these things too.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I mean, something that I mentioned early on in my presentation again is that, my entire thesis, I talked about a lot more than I presented on today, but I didn't find any new objects, right? Like I didn't make any, there was no brand new account book that has been sitting in, a dusty attic for 50 years, or like a chair with an enslaved artisan's signature on it. But what I did was look at objects that we already know in a new way. And I think that as museums everywhere are trying to be better about how they share their collections with people, about how they understand what they have, this is, I think, the most important thing that we can do, is say, the absolute bare minimum is to know what we have and to understand it as best we can. And I think that this is really our imperative and our responsibility now to do this work.
Yeah, I would have been happy if you found a new object, but
I would too, trust me.
Absolutely love that, you weren't using new objects. You were just reading across the sources, connecting the dots and interpreting them in a way that was more inclusive to everyone involved. And your research here in Annapolis is making such a big contribution to this movement. And I was thrilled to see that you were studying this in Annapolis. So
thank you.
Do we want to turn it over for questions?
Yes, thank you. I feel like I have a million questions just myself, but I all of our wonderful participants take center stage. So we're going to start off with Brenda Heindel, and she asked Bethany, you mentioned that the artisans' ownership of slaves was a part of their success and ability to create their objects. Did the ownership of slaves also add to their status in society, and what that conveyed to their customers?
I think absolutely. I think that it is both about, how much work can you get done and how cheaply can you get it done, but it's also about, you know, what is my position in this social landscape and how do people see me, how do people read me? And I think that kind of proof of that, right, is that so many urban artisans become plantation owners. Archibald Chisholm is one of them. He starts out as a cabinet maker in Annapolis, and by the end of his life is a plantation owner. James Hoban, who is the architect of the White House, he's another one of these guys who starts out as an architect working in Charleston and, you know, in DC, and eventually is owning a plantation. And I think that you're absolutely right to kind of see something aspirational there, because I think that is definitely a part of what we see happening, not just in Annapolis, but everywhere.
Yeah, I completely agree. So happy that, okay. So there's a few questions on sources. And this first one is, are there any records that name Black or enslaved artisans particularly? Like, I'm assuming by there.
Yeah. So, I mean, easily are advertisements. There are many, many advertisements, runaway advertisements, right? That say, you know, like I said, Jem is a carpenter and a gardener and a bricklayer. There are also probate inventories. William Buckland's probate inventory is very interesting. This is not about enslaved people, but it's about indentured servants, where he lists, you know, Thomas so-and-so, an indentured bricklayer, and many records associated with enslavers do the same thing. None of them with the people that I discussed today, but you definitely see that elsewhere, and you see that in wills too. An interesting thing about John Shaw's will is that he leaves 2 enslaved men to his only son, who is also a cabinet maker, which really makes you wonder, what work were these 2 men doing in John Shaw's shop that, you know, he left them to his only son, who is also a cabinet maker. But I think that advertisements and kind of those kind of legal documents are usually where names are associated with specific trades and skills. Tiffany might have something to add here too.
I would just add that private papers. One of the things that, you know, makes this work so different from doing traditional decorative arts work is that a lot of people, excuse me, a lot of people weren't writing down exactly what was being done in their shop, because you're talking about enslaved labor, right? And if enslaved people are property, you know, the going thing was, why would I take notes about that? But I've had a lot of luck in looking at private papers, and just looking at, you begin to see, particularly if you're looking at papers regarding the construction of maybe a building, you'll find a lot of names there. One of the things in my research in Charleston that helped was indeed private papers. And I also happened to come across a stack of receipts, which was just this family using the labor of enslaved people, and they would write receipts to the enslavers and say, I'm using your enslaved man for carpentry work for 20 days or so. So definitely private papers.
And can I just ask what archive you were using to find those papers?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I was at the South Carolina Historical Society.
Awesome. Do you find that a lot of this information is accessible through sort of regional historical societies?
Yeah, I would say so. You know, I've also found great information at the Library of Congress. So it really just depends on how much time you have and how much you feel like reading, because it's not, you know, there's no source that just, unfortunately, that just says, you know, here they all are. You actually have to read through it and find those very brief mentions.
Okay, so this one's from Dan Riley, and it's specifically Bethany. I think I heard you say that the finer touches on a piece would not have been executed by enslaved persons. Are we certain of that? And if true, is it because they were not skilled enough, or because they would not have been permitted to do that?
Yeah, so I think that the part you're talking about, I think that I said, or maybe I didn't say this right and it was confusing, was that we really don't know, right? So talking about the clock, there's no way to know whether it was enslaved artisans carving the fretwork or constructing the body of the clock. But they could have been doing that, absolutely. And they could have been doing more menial tasks like planing and, varnishing and all things that, again, like I said, when I was kind of talking about the benefits of knowing how things are made, still require a lot of skill. I think that I would shy away from, that mindset of saying, did they not do this because they were not skilled enough? Because that's falling into this trap, right? That enslaved people weren't as skilled and would not have been doing these things. But I do think that it's important to be clear when we say, we don't know for sure which parts of this piece were created by enslaved craftspeople or apprentices or journeymen or indentured servants or whoever is, in charge of the shop.
And this is from Tessa Goldsher, and this is for Dr. Momon. Your work in material culture is part of a body of research that hugely troubles the traditional narrative of the pristine early American decorative arts patrimony. Do you have any further thoughts on the current state of museum display of relevant objects? As you mentioned, settings like period rooms or chronologically organized galleries inarguably leave much out. Are there any museums or historical sites interpreting such objects and settings well?
I really think it's very much so a case by case thing. I'm sitting here hoping that something jumps out to me, but what I will say though is that of the museums that I have visited, and I'm a public historian, so pre-COVID I went to museums all the time. I always felt like there was more work to be done. I always felt like there's a way to rewrite those museum object labels and to use language that's more inclusive. And, something I encourage all museums to do is to come up with a language guide to determine how you will discuss these things, how your tour guides will discuss it, how you'll write about these things on object labels and things like that. But I think across the board that there's, more work to be done. And, I will say that since the murder of George Floyd back in, I think, May, I've enjoyed sort of seeing this shift and this desire of more institutions to be inclusive and to tell inclusive stories. And so I'm hoping that that shift continues and that museums across the country follow that shift with actionable items.
And I would be remiss to not ask a question from our director, Matt Thurlow. Bethany, given that the last monograph on Shaw was published in 1980, a comprehensive analysis of the construction of his extant work shed any additional light on the contributions of his enslaved craftsmen?
I think absolutely. And this is something that, I would have loved to do if this was like a dissertation length project. Is really go back and account for, what exists, where is it? I mean, there are still so many questions, just even between, is this made by Shaw? Is this made by Chisholm? Is this, Alexander Lowry recently published in Chipstone, or, kind of recently published in Chipstone, his really, really great article where he kind of broke down the furniture that was made by William and Washington Tuck, who were working in Shaw's workshop. And I think that, the stuff is there. It's just having that time to really look closely at all of it. Because, Shaw, like many other artisans, it can be tricky because not everything is labeled, not everything is signed. There are still so many pieces that even the experts are really confused about. So I think definitely.
We're gonna hop back to sort of that museum place and looking at how museums are presenting this information with a question from Alex Mann. Are Winterthur and other museums now recognizing enslaved artisanship not only on labels, but also in their database and cataloging systems and nomenclature structure?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? My sound kind of just cut out.
Alex is asking about how museums are cataloging this information.
So I think that really depends on where you're going, right? And it depends on whether or not any kind of large scale cataloging efforts are being made. I think kind of like an eternal problem is many museums, you look at the catalog records and they were done, very quickly when an object was brought into the collection, or they were done 25 years ago, or they were done by someone who is maybe not the primary curator or the expert in how something was made. And I think that this is very much part of what we have to do now, is really take stock of what we have. And get the right people looking at things and take the time to do this research and write these really detailed catalog entries, because that's the first step for so many people doing research, right, is asking for a catalog entry and reading that. And that also means keeping updated records on your website, keeping updated records in any digital databases that you might have. And I don't want to imply that this is easy, because these are all things that take so much time.
Tiffany, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with that. I think that, one of the things that I was encouraged about with Bethany's research was just that idea that she didn't discover any new objects. She just took the time to look at known objects differently. And so I think that that's a great starting point, is going back to what you already have, re-examining those records, re-examining what, somebody wrote 25 years ago about an object, and seeing what more you can learn about the object given what we know now. So much more information is accessible these days. So a good re-examination is always needed.
This one's from Michael Phillips. Could you talk about how what was happening in Annapolis during this period is similar or different from other major early American urban centers?
Yeah, so one of the things in my thesis that I wanted to be really careful about was being very clear and saying that many of the things happening in Annapolis are happening in urban centers, all throughout the British Atlantic world, but that local conditions and local just things on the ground, the people that are there, things that are happening can really, change what's going on. So something about Annapolis that I think is really important to understand is that, I call it a city, and it was and is a city, but Annapolis is really small. Even at its height, Annapolis is some people would argue with me and say that Annapolis is a really big town and not a city. And I think that's really important, because especially after the revolution, when Baltimore really rises to economic and social prominence, Annapolis and Baltimore are completely different in almost every way. I mean, Seth Rockman and other scholars have written about how enslaved people would run away to Baltimore because there was such a large population of free and enslaved Black people in the city that they felt like they could blend in there easily. That is not the case in Annapolis. And Annapolis is also really interesting. So to go back to Alexander Lowry, who made this argument in his article for Chipstone, Annapolis is really interesting too, because again, once Baltimore starts rising in the 1770s and then just, skyrockets from there, state patronage is really, really important in Annapolis. I mean, the only reason that guys like John Shaw survive are because they're given commission after commission from the state. And the state knows this, right? All of their wealthy people are fleeing to Baltimore. All of the artisans are going to follow them. That's their clientele. People like William Faris are paid to turn the clocks in the State House. John Shaw, is commissioned for furniture. He becomes the superintendent of the building project for the State House. And this is actually so important that it's an entire chapter of my thesis, is talking about the importance of state patronage. And while that certainly happens elsewhere, I think it becomes really, really central to both slavery and craft, and kind of the how slavery is sustained in Annapolis through craftspeople, right? It's through the patronage of the state. And I think that's something that is different from other places for sure.
So I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Again, I know there is another event tonight, so we're going to try to be cognizant, but this is an important question. Bethany, why did you change quote unquote Negro in the quote to enslaved when you read it?
Yeah, so you'll probably get, different answers to a question like this depending on who you ask. But for me, this is a personal choice. I don't feel like I'm doing any good by repeating a word that is harmful, that is offensive, that is racist, whether in a period quote or not. What I'm saying still gets the point across, and I did leave it on the screen for you to read, kind of the uninterrupted quote. But as a white person, I don't think that it is my place to repeat that language, to repeat harmful language. And I just think that, I don't know, this is just kind of how I do my own practice. And I think, many people do the same. And yeah, so I mean, even during the time, right? Like this is a derogatory word, whether it's historic or not. And I know many people would probably argue that, if it's in a period quote, why don't you say it? Well, because it was just as harmful then as it is now. And I don't feel the need to kind of perpetuate that harm if I don't have to.
Thank you. So John Bacon asked a question that's been floating around my head as well, and that's simply women artisans. A lot of the conversation tonight has been focused on the contribution of enslaved craftspeople who I am assuming are mostly males.
Yeah, actually, so Tiffany and I were talking earlier and this came up, just kind of offhanded comment about how, I wish that I knew more about enslaved women artisans. In my thesis, I do actually, so if you're familiar with Maryland, if you're familiar with John Shaw, you may be familiar with the John Shaw flag, which is a version of the American flag that Governor William Paca asked John Shaw to design for the arrival of Congress in Annapolis. And this flag is very interesting. And we can actually tie this specifically to an indentured servant, a girl who was indentured to Shaw to learn, the trade of being a seamstress. But Shaw also was enslaving women at this time. And Paca commissioned 2 flags that were something like 9 by 13 feet. I mean, they were massive with, I think, a 2-week turnaround. So that was kind of one of the rare moments in my thesis that I did get to explore women's labor, which is also something that's important to me, but like enslaved labor is often overlooked and often absent from the archive.
And I would say for me, what we're looking at as we start our research is really paying attention to identifying more Black women craftspeople. We majority of the time we find them, as seamstresses or needle workers. But there is a little group of women that I'm working on doing some research on right now in Charleston, but more like present day Mount Pleasant, who are brick masons, and they are making bricks at a large brick plantation. So that's, I'm hoping to flesh that out more as time goes on, just to see what types of contributions women made in trades that you don't necessarily think of them being involved in the 18th century.
Well, that's great. And you're both doing such amazing work, and we are so happy to continue to share and support your scholarship here at the Trust. I'm so looking forward to seeing everything that you both accomplish and achieve as you continue on your professional careers doing all of these incredible projects. Thank you so much for your time. I know how busy both of you are, and it has meant so much to our members and all of our participants to be able to be here tonight and to hear all this fascinating research. And I am so sorry if you can't hear me. A recording of the presentation will be available in about a week, along with a blog post that will help you kind of just get a summary of the presentation. If you enjoyed this lecture tonight, and you're interested in supporting the work of emerging scholars, please donate to the Decorative Arts Trust. We depend on your support and participation. Again, thank you so much. Look forward to other upcoming virtual programs that we're hosting, another Trust Talk next month, as well as an in-person program in Philadelphia. It's going to be really great. Thank you all again and have a lovely night. Bye.
Thank you.